In the winter of 2022, 414 wild bison were loaded onto trucks at Yellowstone's northern boundary and driven east across Wyoming and South Dakota to Lakota land. None of those animals had ever walked that ground. Neither had their parents or their grandparents or any bison in living memory. The people waiting for them had not shared the plains with a wild herd in generations. The reason for that gap goes back to a single number. In 1902, there were 23 wild bison left on Earth. 23. The entire species was funneled down to one small herd clinging to a Yellowstone valley. What happened between that number and the 414 animals on those trucks is a 120-year chain of decisions, some catastrophic, some quietly brilliant, and it ends with wild bison coming home to Lakota land on their own terms. To understand what the 2022 transfer actually meant, you need to sit with what the 1880s actually did. At the start of the 19th century, somewhere between 30 and 60 million bison moved across North America. The honest answer is nobody knows the exact number, because no one alive at the time thought they needed to count them. The herds were so large, they took days to pass a single point on the plains, so dense that travelers wrote about the ground itself appearing to move. The idea that this animal could be threatened would have seemed absurd to anyone watching it in 1830. By 1889, fewer than 1,000 remained. In under 6 decades, one of the largest animal populations on the continent had been reduced by more than 99%. This was not accidental. The hide trade drove the initial slaughter. Bison hides were worth real money, and professional hunters could kill dozens of animals in a single day from a fixed position, skinning them and leaving the carcasses to rot. The bones were later collected and ground into fertilizer, sold by the ton. But the hide trade alone does not explain the speed or completeness of the kill. U.S. military commanders and federal officials explicitly encouraged the slaughter because they understood something the hide hunters did not particularly care about. Bison were the economic and logistical foundation of Plains Indian life, and without them, resistance to westward expansion became nearly impossible to sustain. General Philip Sheridan reportedly told the Texas legislature that hunters deserved medals, not restrictions, because they were destroying the commissary that fed the tribes. That was the policy. It was not a side effect. For the Lakota specifically, the consequences were structural in ways that go beyond food. The seasonal bison hunt organized everything: labor, ceremony, the movement of camps, the storage of food for winter, and trade relationships with neighboring nations. The hunt was not just an event in the calendar, it was the calendar. When the bison went, the entire framework of Sikangu life that had been built around them over centuries went with it. You cannot separate the slaughter of the bison from the simultaneous campaign to force Plains nations onto reservations, because both were instruments of the same policy. The land the Sikangu were confined to after the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, along with the dramatically reduced territory left after the 1889 Sioux Act carved the Great Sioux Reservation into smaller pieces, became Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. Roughly 1.1 million acres. What the federal government wanted that land to produce was not a restored prairie. Federal allotment programs pushed cattle ranching as the civilized alternative to the bison hunt, and over the following decades, the land was reshaped accordingly. Fences went in. Native grasses were broken up. Water sources were engineered for livestock rather than migratory grazers. The landscape learned a new animal. By 1902, the last wild bison on the continent outside captivity were a small group inside Yellowstone National Park. The count that year put the number at 23. Not 23,000, not 2,300. 23 animals in a single mountain valley representing the entire wild genetic legacy of a species that had once shaped the ecology of half a continent. What recovery would actually require from that point was not simply a matter of protecting those 23 animals and letting the numbers grow. The bison were gone from the plains. The ecological role they played, the grazing patterns, the wallowing, the soil disturbance, had been absent from most of their former range for a generation already. And the people who had built a civilization around that relationship were living on land that had been deliberately restructured to make bison irrelevant. Getting the bison back was not a wildlife problem. It was a political, ecological, and cultural problem, all running simultaneously. Yellowstone National Park was established in 1872, and the people who drew its boundary were not thinking about bison. They were thinking about geysers, the hot springs, the thermal basins, the geological spectacle, and that is what the 1872 legislation was protecting. The fact that this particular rectangle of Wyoming and Montana happened to contain the last wild bison herd on the continent was, in the most literal sense, an accident of geography. But that accident mattered more than almost any deliberate conservation decision made in the same era. Yellowstone's remote terrain, including high valleys, heavy winters, and difficult access, made commercial hunting harder there than on the open plains. The bison that survived into the 1880s and the 1890s did so partly because getting to them was genuinely difficult, and partly because the park, despite having almost no enforcement capacity in its early decades, at least existed as a legal boundary. When Congress finally passed the Lacey Act in 1894, specifically to stop poaching inside the park, the 23 animals counted in 1902 had a framework around them that, however fragile, was more than existed anywhere else. Recovery from 23 was slow. By the 1930s, the Yellowstone herd had reached a few hundred animals, but recovery is a misleading word for what was actually happening. Park managers ran culls throughout the mid-20th century to keep the population from exceeding what they considered the park's carrying capacity. Animals were shipped to zoos, sold to private ranches, and slaughtered outright to prevent overgrazing. The Yellowstone bison were alive, but they were managed like livestock, their numbers kept deliberately low for decades by the same federal agency nominally responsible for their protection. The deeper problem was what happened every winter at the park's northern boundary. When snow depths made forage inside the park scarce, bison drifted north toward lower elevation land in Montana. Cattle ranchers there, and the Montana state government, treated every bison that crossed the boundary as a disease threat. The disease in question was brucellosis, a bacterial infection that bison can carry without showing symptoms, and which causes cattle to abort pregnancies. The science on actual transmission risk from wild bison to cattle under normal range conditions was, and remains, genuinely complicated. But the political reality was simple. Ranchers did not want bison on their land, and state governments backed them. For most of the 20th century, Yellowstone bison that crossed into Montana were shot, hundreds of animals in some winters. This is the world the InterTribal Buffalo Council entered in 1992. Founded by a coalition of tribal nations who wanted bison back on native lands, the council started with a straightforward idea. Yellowstone was culling bison anyway, so why not transfer those animals to tribes instead of killing them? The council grew to represent 88 tribes and began building what would eventually become a collective intertribal herd of over 20,000 animals. But the brucellosis problem did not disappear just because tribes were asking for the bison. State governments and the livestock industry blocked transfers for years, and the federal bureaucracy that managed Yellowstone's population had no clean mechanism to move animals to tribal lands without triggering exactly the political resistance that had kept the transfers stalled. The breakthrough came through a quarantine protocol. The Bison Conservation Transfer Program, developed collaboratively between the National Park Service, tribal nations, and the InterTribal Buffalo Council, established a process where Yellowstone bison, animals captured during winter management operations that would previously have been culled, could instead be held in quarantine facilities, tested repeatedly for brucellosis over multiple years, and once cleared, transferred to tribal herds. The process takes 4 to 5 years per cohort, and it is slow, but it converted what had been a slaughter into a pipeline, and more than 600 Yellowstone bison reached tribal lands through that pipeline between 2019 and the time the 414 animals boarded trucks in 2022. The pipeline existed. What the Lakota had spent years building was the destination. The name matters. Wolakota is a Lakota word that translates roughly as to live in the Lakota way. It is not a bison management area. It is not a wildlife conservation zone. The Rosebud Sioux Tribe enterprise arm, Saikangu Company, chose that name deliberately because what they were building on 28,000 acres of South Dakota grassland was never primarily a conservation project. It was a framework for living differently on land that had been shaped by a century of other priorities. Those 28,000 acres had been running cattle. For decades, that land was leased to ranchers, producing beef under a management system built around fences, fixed water points, and continuous grazing pressure from animals that stay where you put them. Converting it back to native prairie was not a matter of simply removing the cattle and waiting. The infrastructure that supports cattle and the infrastructure that supports bison are genuinely different, and converting one to the other takes real work. Fencing grids designed to keep livestock in fixed pastures had to be reconfigured into larger units that allow bison to move across the landscape the way their grazing behavior actually requires. Water sources engineered for stationary herds had to be repositioned or opened up. Native grass reseeding started in areas where decades of cattle use had left bare ground or introduced species that filled the gaps. This is not a fast process, and Saikangu Company was not pretending otherwise. The conversion was a long-term land decision, not an event. The World Wildlife Fund came in as a partner, bringing funding, technical support, and ecological monitoring capacity. But the structural arrangement matters. The Rosebud Sioux Tribe holds management authority over Wolakota. The World Wildlife Fund is a partner, not the lead. That distinction separates Wolakota from the pattern of 20th century conservation projects on or near tribal land, where outside institutions controlled the decisions and native communities were consulted at best, displaced at worst. Here, the Saikangu Lakota set the management goals, make the land decisions, and own the outcomes. The first bison from Yellowstone arrived in 2020, moving through the BCTP quarantine pipeline that had been building capacity since 2019. That founding transfer established the herd on land that had not carried bison in generations, and the early animals were doing what bison do immediately, moving across the landscape, grazing in patterns that cattle never produced, beginning the slow biological negotiation between the animals and a prairie that had been waiting for them in an ecological sense for a very long time. By 2022, the herd had grown. The 28,000 acres were working as a functioning prairie system, not just a holding pen, and the Wolakota project had reached the point where a major expansion made sense. That generated the request for 414 additional animals from Yellowstone, not a rescue operation for bison that had nowhere else to go, but a planned addition to a prairie ecosystem that had demonstrated it could support a larger herd. The BCTP quarantine pipeline produced those animals after years of testing, and in the winter of 2022, the trucks made the drive from Wyoming to South Dakota. 414 animals is a specific number, and it represents something beyond a head count. Each of those bison had been through a multi-year quarantine process. Each one was genetically descended from the 23 wild animals that survived inside Yellowstone in 1902. And each one was being placed on tribal land managed by the people whose ancestors had built a civilization built around exactly this species on this kind of ground, before the slaughter took both the bison and the framework apart simultaneously. The trucks arrived, the gates opened, and then the prairie started doing something that cattle ranching, for all its productivity, had never been able to produce. Here is what most people get wrong about bison restoration. They picture it as replacing one large grazing animal with another. Cattle were here, now bison are here, the grass recovers, done. That framing misses the actual mechanism. The actual mechanism is why the ecological data from sites like Wolakota are so different from anything produced under cattle management. Bison are not just grazers that happen to be native, they are a disturbance engine. The prairie co-evolved with over millions of years. The grasses, the soils, the invertebrate communities, the water systems, all of it developed alongside bison, shaped by bison behavior, and in many cases depended on it. When the bison left, the prairie did not stay the same and wait. It drifted. Slowly, across decades, the system that had been built around that disturbance regime started losing the complexity it could not maintain without it. Start with wallowing, because it is the behavior that surprises people most. Bison roll. They find dry patches of bare soil and throw themselves into them, twisting their bodies against the ground to shed parasites and to cool down in summer heat. A single wallow is a shallow depression 6 to 10 feet wide, and on its own, it looks like damage, bare ground, disturbed soil, a hole in the grass. What it actually does is create a microhabitat the surrounding grassland cannot produce on its own. When rain comes, the wallow holds water. It becomes a temporary pool, sometimes lasting days, sometimes weeks, depending on soil type and rainfall. Research by Knapp and colleagues, published in Bioscience in 1999, documented these depressions as genuine biodiversity hotspots, supporting amphibians, aquatic invertebrates, and plant species that simply cannot establish in flat, continuously grazed grassland. A prairie with active bison will have thousands of these wallows at different stages of use, drying, and revegetation, creating a mosaic of conditions that no other management practice reliably generates. Then there is how bison actually graze, which is fundamentally different from cattle in ways that matter at the soil level. Bison move. They graze an area hard, then leave it, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, before returning. This is not random wandering. It is a grazing pattern that allows native grasses to recover fully between grazing events, rebuilding root mass, rebuilding soil organic matter, closing the canopy back over bare ground before the next round of pressure arrives. Cattle in fixed pastures cannot do this. They stay where the fences keep them, returning to the same ground before it is recovered, which over time shifts the competitive balance away from deep-rooted native grasses toward shallow-rooted opportunists and introduced species that can tolerate persistent defoliation. The science on this distinction is now quantified well enough to be specific. A 2019 study by Hillenbrand and colleagues, conducted in South Dakota shortgrass prairie, the same ecosystem type as Wolakota, compared bison grazed areas to cattle grazed areas directly. Bison grazing increased soil carbon stocks, improved water infiltration rates, and reduced both bare ground and invasive plant cover compared to cattle. The mechanism behind the soil carbon finding is partly physical. Bison hooves, on bison scale movement patterns, compress and aerate soil differently than cattle hooves under continuous stocking, restructuring the soil profile over time in ways that favor carbon retention and water absorption. The plant diversity result from Reintroducing and colleagues, published in PNAS in 2022, went further. Across long-term experimental grassland plots, bison reintroduction doubled native plant species richness compared to ungrazed prairie. Not compared to badly managed prairie, compared to ungrazed prairie left entirely alone. The bison grazing produced more native plant diversity than doing nothing, and it outperformed prescribed burning, which is currently the most widely used tool in grassland management. No other single intervention in the study produced a comparable effect. None of this is an argument against cattle ranching as a land use. Cattle are productive animals, well suited to producing food at scale. The point is narrower and more precise. Cattle are optimized for production, and bison are optimized for prairie. They do different things to the same ground, and those differences compound across years and decades into genuinely distinct ecological outcomes. What Wolakota's monitoring data is starting to show, native grass coverage expanding, wallow formation in the first seasons, ground that was bare under cattle closing over with native species, is consistent with exactly what the experimental literature predicted would happen when the right animal came back to the right land. The science explains the mechanism. What it cannot fully capture is what this looks like to the people whose grandparents remembered a time when this was simply how the plains worked. The word cultural undersells it. When people describe the Lakota relationship with bison as cultural, they usually mean ceremonial, songs, rituals, spiritual significance. Those things are real, but they are also the part easiest to abstract into something soft and symbolic. What actually got destroyed in the 1870s and the 1880s was not primarily symbolic. It was operational. The seasonal bison hunt was the organizing structure of Sakangu life in the way that a tax system and a supply chain and a labor market are the organizing structures of an industrial economy. It determined when camps moved and where. It determined how food was preserved, how trade relationships with neighboring nations were maintained, how surpluses were built ahead of winter, how ceremonial cycles aligned with the availability of the animal at the center of almost everything. The hunt was not a feature of Sakangu culture. It was the load-bearing wall. Federal officials in the late 19th century understood this better than most modern accounts give them credit for. The push to exterminate bison was not incidentally damaging to Plains nations, it was intentional. Removing the bison was a strategy for removing the economic and logistical independence of nations that had not yet been fully subdued. When the bison were gone, the capacity to resist, to move, to feed yourself outside the federal ration system went with them. What replaced the bison on reservation land was not a neutral alternative. Cattle ranching was pushed through federal allotment programs as the civilized model of land use, and with it came a completely different relationship to the land itself. Stationary rather than migratory, fenced rather than open, producing for external markets rather than sustaining a community's seasonal cycle. That substitution reshaped both the land and the people living on it simultaneously, and for roughly 130 years, the Rosebud Reservation held cattle instead of bison. Children grew up without ever seeing the animal at the center of their oral history, their ceremony, their grandparents' stories. The knowledge of bison, how they moved, what their presence meant ecologically, how the hunt was conducted, and how the animal was used completely, wasting nothing, survived in oral tradition and in the memory of elders, but it had no physical referent. It was knowledge about something absent. When bison started appearing on Wolakota land after 2020, what changed was not just the ecology. Elders who carried ceremonial knowledge built around bison now had living animals in front of them. Young tribal members taking on roles in land management and ecological monitoring at Wolakota were learning a relationship with that animal that connected directly to what their grandparents had described. The knowledge systems that survived 150 years of suppression about bison behavior, about how the prairie responds to their presence, about what a healthy relationship between people and that landscape looks and functions like, suddenly had something to attach to again. They had a living referent. The food sovereignty dimension is concrete in ways that matter for daily life on the reservation. Rosebud has faced severe food insecurity for generations, and the bison meat that Wolakota produces for tribal members reconnects nutrition with cultural practice in a way that no commodity food program can replicate. This is not a side benefit of a conservation project, it is one of the reasons the project exists. Food sovereignty matters. What's happening at Wolakota is a transfer of knowledge running in both directions. Elders pass ceremonial understanding of bison to younger community members who now have direct experience to match it against. Land managers apply generational ecological knowledge alongside the monitoring protocols that the World Wildlife Fund partnership brought in. Two ways of understanding the same prairie run simultaneously, each making the other more legible. The herd is rebuilding more than grass. It's rebuilding the human knowledge systems that developed alongside the bison over centuries and that had nowhere to fully live while the bison were gone. Pull back from Wolakota for a moment and look at the full picture, because the scale of what has happened since 2019 is easy to underestimate if you stay focused on a single herd on a single reservation. The Wolakota Buffalo Range now carries more than 1,200 bison on those 28,000 acres, making it the largest tribally owned herd in North America. That number sits in a specific historical context. In 1902, there were 23 wild bison alive on the continent. The entire recovery of wild bison genetics, the entire foundation of every tribal herd and every conservation program that followed, traces back through that bottleneck. The 1,200 animals at Wolakota are all descended from animals that nearly did not make it through. Zoom out further, and the InterTribal Buffalo Council picture comes into view. 88 tribes, collectively managing more than 20,000 bison across North America. That number grew from essentially nothing in 1992 when the council was founded and the collective intertribal herd was a fraction of what it is now. Tribal nations, operating across millions of acres of habitat on their own land, have become some of the most consequential bison conservation actors on the continent, not because federal agencies handed them that role, but because they built the infrastructure to claim it. The Bison Conservation Transfer Program numbers tell their own story. More than 600 Yellowstone bison reached tribal lands between 2019 and 2022. Before that pipeline existed, winter management operations at Yellowstone's northern boundary were producing hundreds of dead bison per year, animals removed to prevent population pressure at the park edge, pressure that brought the brucellosis politics back every season. The Bison Conservation Transfer Program did not eliminate that pressure entirely, but it redirected a significant portion of it. Animals that would have been culled went instead through quarantine and then onto tribal land. That shift is structural, not symbolic, and it changed what Yellowstone's surplus population actually becomes. The quarantine timeline still governs the pace, and it is worth being honest about what that means. A 4 to 5 year process per cohort limits how fast the pipeline can move. The 414 animals that arrived at Wolakota in 2022 represented years of accumulated quarantine work, not a decision that could be made and executed in a single season. Scaling the transfers faster would require either accelerating the quarantine protocol, which depends on brucellosis science, not political will, or building more quarantine facility capacity, which takes capital and coordination. The bottleneck is real. So is the counterpoint that any honest account of this story must include. 1,200 bison on 28,000 acres is a genuine achievement. The InterTribal Buffalo Council's 20,000 animals across tribal lands is a genuine achievement. And the full ecological function of bison on North American grasslands operated at a scale that makes both numbers look like a starting point. 30 to 60 million animals covering somewhere around 500 million acres built the disturbance regime that made the prairie ecology, and that is the system the Hillenbrand and Ratajczak studies are measuring partial recovery from. What exists now is not a restored continental grassland system. It is a set of functioning nodes, some growing, some better managed than others, spread across a landscape that is mostly still doing something else. That is not an argument for pessimism. That is an argument for precision about what recovery means when the gap between where you started and where you are trying to go is measured in hundreds of millions of animals and centuries of ecological function. Wolakota is real progress. The continent is not fixed. The Wolakota project didn't invent any of its individual components. Quarantine-based bison transfers existed before 2020. WWF had funded conservation work for decades. Native land management wasn't a new concept. What Wolakota assembled was a specific combination of those pieces in a specific structural arrangement, and that arrangement is what makes it worth studying as a model rather than a one-off achievement. The four elements are tribal management authority, a federal transfer pipeline, peer-reviewed ecological science, and cultural restoration goals. The critical detail is that none of them functions the same way when separated from the others. The BCTP pipeline, without a tribally controlled destination, produces animals with nowhere meaningful to go. Ecological science without management authority produces recommendations that external agencies can ignore. Cultural restoration without a functioning land base stays abstract. The Wolakota structure holds these things together in a way that makes each one more durable than it would be alone. Land tenure is the foundation. The whole structure sits on. The Rosebud Sioux tribe owns the decision-making authority at Wolakota, which means the project's continuity doesn't depend on the goodwill of a state government that changes with elections or a federal administration that can reverse course on public lands policy. Tribal sovereignty is the insulating layer. Conservation projects that rely on federal land access or state cooperation have a different kind of fragility. They can be dismantled by a budget cycle or a political shift in a way that a tribally controlled project on tribal land cannot. That's not a minor operational detail. It's the reason the model can support a 20-year land conversion and not just a 5-year grant cycle. What Sikangu land managers bring to the project that no outside institution can replicate is generational ecological knowledge, not as a cultural artifact, but as a working technical system. The understanding of how bison move across a prairie, which areas they use in which seasons, how the land responds across years rather than monitoring periods, how the relationship between a community and a landscape gets maintained rather than just measured, these are things that developed over centuries of direct observation, and that Western conservation science, for all the rigor of the Reintroducing and Hillenbrand studies, is still building formal frameworks to describe. At Wolakota, both knowledge systems are operating simultaneously on the same ground. That combination produces management decisions that neither system would reach working alone. The policy shift this represents is worth naming plainly. For most of the 20th century, bison conservation was primarily a federal project. The NPS managed Yellowstone's herd. Private ranchers controlled most other bison on the continent. Tribal nations asking for transfers were told to wait while the brucellosis politics worked themselves out. The ITBC and the BCTP together moved the center of gravity. Tribal lands are now where the most significant bison conservation work is happening, and the Wolakota scale is 1,200 animals, 28,000 acres, and a functioning prairie system with documented ecological recovery. That is what that shift looks like when it has room to develop fully. 88 tribes are watching this closely. The ITBC structure means that what Wolakota demonstrates is immediately replicable to nations across the continent who hold millions of acres of potential bison habitat and are asking whether this is replicable on their land. The quarantine pipeline keeps growing. The ecological data keeps accumulating. And if even a fraction of those tribes move toward large-scale cattle to bison conversion on tribal land, the cumulative effect on Great Plains soil carbon, native plant diversity, and water infiltration across connected landscapes becomes something you can measure at a regional scale, not as a projection, but as an outcome running on land that the people managing it have every reason to protect for the next generation and the one after that. The model works. The question is, how many places build it? Picture the logistics for a moment, because they are easy to gloss over. You do not load 414 wild bison onto trucks the way you load cattle. These animals had been through quarantine handling, but they were not domesticated, were not conditioned to human management, and were not cooperative in any ordinary sense. Moving them required the kind of careful, slow-motion pressure that works with animals that panic easily and weigh 1,000 pounds. The drive from Yellowstone's northern range across Wyoming and into South Dakota covered hundreds of miles. When the trailers finally pulled onto Rosebud land and the gates opened, the bison did not hesitate. They moved the way bison move, with weight and purpose, out onto ground their species had not touched in over a century. What happened next was not dramatic in any visible, immediate way. The prairie does not announce its recovery. But the biological process that started the moment those animals hit the grass was exactly what the Hillenbrand data, the Reintroducing data, and the Knapp Wallow research all pointed toward. Within the first seasons at Wolakota, wallows began forming in areas that had been flat, continuously grazed cattle pasture for decades. Native grasses started pushing back into patches of bare ground. Bird species that need varied grass structure, the kind that pulse grazing creates and continuous stocking destroys, started showing up in areas they had not used before. The monitoring data coming out of Wolakota tracks directly against what the experimental literature predicted, which means the prairie remembered faster than anyone had a right to expect. The arc from 23 to 1,200 is the number that holds the whole story. 23 wild animals in a Yellowstone valley in 1902 were reduced there by a slaughter that was partly commercial and partly a deliberate strategy to break the Plains nations who depended on them. 120 years of fragile, contested, slow-moving recovery followed. And now the largest tribally owned bison herd in North America is on Lakota land, managed by Sikangu people whose grandparents carried the knowledge of this relationship through generations when the animal itself was gone. The Sikangu framing of Wolakota is worth taking seriously as a final note. This is not a conservation project that native people benefit from. It is a Lakota-led restoration that produces outcomes the Western scientific community can measure. The bison are back, the prairie is responding, and the people in the land are relearning each other after 150 years apart. That process does not have a finish line. Wolakota proves something specific, returning the right animal to the right land, managed by the people who built a civilization around both, produces results no outside institution has matched. If you want to understand how keystone species reshape entire ecosystems, watch this next. And subscribe. This channel covers exactly these kinds of evidence-based stories every week.